Hello, my name is Precious Ozoemena. I'll be making this presentation on behalf of Professor Chinyere Ukaga from Igwe University. So we'll be looking at deafness, not a pathology or cause, addressing the social stigmatization against African deaf people. So at the end of this presentation, we should be able to understand the definition of deafness, the definition of pathology, and some other terminologies used in this presentation. And then we'll be able to understand the probable cause of deafness and if deafness is a pathology or a cause. Then we would review success stories of prominent deaf persons globally and in Africa, and then we'll narrow it down to Nigeria. Then we'll look at the Nigerian government's efforts towards deafness and the strategies that has been put in place to minimize stigmatization of deaf persons. Okay, so the next slide, we are talking about some definitions. So the word deafness, we use it is referred to certain health conditions that is characterized by either partial or total loss of hearing. It could range from mild to severe hearing loss. And then we have hard of hearing. We could say it's a partial loss of hearing. So it's not like the person cannot hear at all. So you could just hear a little, but not completely. And most times they actually requires aid for them to hear well. That's hard of hearing. So we'll talk about hearing impairment. Hearing impairment is actually an umbrella word, so to say. So that is a term that is used to describe both total deafness and hard of hearing. So we'll talk about auditory disability. So this terminology is used to describe a medical condition that hinders someone from being able to hear or understand some sound. So the word audiological condition, as the name implies, audiology, so anything that has to do with sound, whatever condition that affects the abnormal functioning of the auditory system, that's what is called audiological condition. So next is the sensorineural hearing loss. So in the ear, we have the outer ear, the middle ear, and the inner ear. So when the inner ear or the auditory nerve is being affected, this could lead to hearing loss. And this type of hearing loss is what we refer to as sensorineural hearing loss. So the next one is conductive hearing loss. So that one basically affects just the middle ear or the outer ear. Any problem at all that affects either the middle ear or the outer ear is the conductive hearing loss. Okay, the next slide, to further understand the meaning of the word deafness, we carried out a short survey amongst students and staff of a tertiary institution. The total respondents were 58. And out of these 58 persons, about 96.6% of these people actually defined deafness as the inability to hear well, while the other little percentage says it's inability to communicate effectively. So the survey didn't stop there. We also tried to sample their opinions about the possible causes of deafness. Some persons said that it could be as a result of hearing infection. Some said it could be as a result of disease from birth, that's congenital. While others said it could be as a result of accident, probably head injury, application of the wrong eardrops. You know, most of these people that get unprescribed drugs and they use in their ears and then boom, it could lead to deafness. And then some, it could be accidents during childbirth, while some could be exposure to harmful or sharp objects that could damage the ear. Some said it could be as a result of prolonged exposure to loud noise. Like some persons that work in factories that use heavy machines, heavy equipment that generates a lot of sound. Most of these people, if they are not provided with the proper personal protective equipment, there are chances that continuous exposure to this type of sound might actually lead to deafness. And then some said it could be hereditary, that is, it runs in the family. And then some said it could be as a result of wrong medications and wrong prescriptions. So here are the statistics that we gathered basically about the possible causes of deafness. So the next slide, Deafness is actually not a cause. Some persons believe that, oh, maybe someone's great grandfather committed one atrocity and then the gods decided to punish them by giving them a deaf child. That is just a myth, right? So deafness is not a curse. It is actually the inability of a person to hear and then to hear spoken language and communicate using spoken language. Deaf persons generally have been faced with a lot of stigmatization and discrimination because of the myths because of the myths surrounding the concept of deafness. But as time goes on, as history unfolds, as technology advances, people begin to understand that these are unique people with unique culture and linguistic identity. These people have their own language, which is called sign language, that they use to communicate effectively among themselves and among the people that understand and use the language. So we move over to the word pathology. The word pathology, it can be split into two: path to mean disease and logy to mean study or science. So the study of a disease. So in this case, we're looking at deafness. So the study of the word deafness. So deafness, we could say that deafness is pathological if it affects the abnormal functioning of the auditory system. Remember when we defined the sensorineural hearing loss and the conditional hearing loss as well. So we talked about the abnormal functioning of the auditory nerve and so on. So in a situation like that, we could say that deafness is pathological because in the real sense of the word, it actually affects the normal functioning of the auditory system. But we have a more broad understanding of the word deafness. We begin to see this group of persons, the deaf, as a linguistic and cultural minority. So these people, they see the world differently with the use of sign language. They communicate with the use of sign language. They have a linguistic identity. So they don't see this as a medical condition. Instead, they are a group of people that have their own linguistic and cultural identity. All what they need is support and an enabling environment for them to thrive and achieve their goals in life. So in doing this, we need to be more inclusive. We need to begin to break the barriers that actually affect the day-to-day activities and the day-to-day life of deaf persons in Nigeria and in Africa. So we have a number of persons that has broken barriers against deaf persons that we're going to look at in the next slide. So we have someone named Ludwig. So he started losing his hearing when he was in his 20s, and it got to a point he became completely deaf. But that didn't discourage him. He kept on advancing in his music career, and today he can be remembered as one of the best musicians. He left a legacy. So you can see that he broke the barrier. His being deaf did not limit him. It didn't stop him from pursuing his dreams. So the next person we are going to talk about is Helen Keller. Of course, she's very popular. So Helen Keller is deaf blind. At 18 months, she had brain fever, and as a result of that, she became deaf and she couldn't see anymore. So she was deaf blind, but that didn't discourage her. She started learning how to communicate. She had a mentor, Anne. So Anne was teaching her finger spelling and how to use different communication methods. She made progress in life and she became a graduate. She had Bachelor of Arts degree and she became a writer and communicated with millions of people globally. She visited so many places, including veterans. So Helen Keller actually made history. She didn't allow her disability to pose a barrier to her. She was resilient. She overcame all the barriers. So the next slide talks about other deaf persons too that has made significant efforts to bridge the barriers that are faced by deaf persons. We'll just take one from Africa. We have Dr. Musa Polaka. He's from Kenya. He's a Kenyan, and he has been championing the deaf education and the deaf rights of deaf persons in Kenya. So he has made significant efforts. He didn't allow his disability, he didn't allow his deafness to limit him. And then we now want to narrow it down to Nigeria. We have some deaf persons in Nigeria, both the ones living in Nigeria and outside Nigeria, that has made significant contributions despite being deaf. They have made significant contributions in advancing deaf literacy, deaf education. So we have Mr. Chris Ogubanjo. He's an artist. He didn't allow his deafness to limit him. He has wonderful artwork, and this artwork portrays Nigerian culture, and it has been displayed in so many places, not just locally but also internationally. So we have Bukola Ayinde. She's a deaf woman, and she's the founder of Deaf Women Aloud initiative that helps to promote and advocate for deaf women in Nigeria. We have other persons like Ayodele, Olaito Olaide, and so many others that has advanced deaf literacy and have helped to bridge the gap, that has helped to reduce the barriers faced by deaf persons, and that did not allow their deafness to affect them. So next we'll be talking about the challenges that deaf persons in Nigeria experience. We'll take it one at a time. So we'll talk about access to healthcare services. So deaf persons in Nigeria face significant barrier when it comes to accessing healthcare facilities in the country. If you look at the Nigerian health system, most times you won't find qualified sign language interpreters that helps to pass the message from the deaf to the health professional, or from the health professional to the deaf. And this poses a lot of challenge, because when they can't express themselves, you can agree with me that they would find it difficult, discouraging, if not impossible, to visit the hospital when they should. And of course, that wouldn't end well. And most of these healthcare professionals, they are not well trained to handle matters concerning deaf persons. And so most of them would rather not attend to them, or decide to attend to them later, or probably tell them, oh, you're coming to the hospital, why didn't you come with an interpreter But ideally, these are the things that the government and other well-meaning individuals are to make available for deaf persons so that they can have equal access to healthcare in the country. So deaf persons also face stigmatization and discrimination. A lot of name calling. In some regions in Nigeria, you hear something like Amudi, you hear something like Bebebe, you hear something like Kuruma. They call them a lot of names, a lot of name calling. And most times, some persons that believe that, oh, people become deaf because their ancestors or their parents or whoever committed some atrocity and that's why they became deaf. They wouldn't want to associate with the person. Some want to ask a deaf person something and they'll be looking at probably an interpreter or someone that is with the deaf, and you're asking. Meanwhile, you can actually look at the deaf and talk to him or talk to her. So we talk about the educational challenges that are faced by deaf persons. So in Nigeria, deaf persons face educational challenges. Most times these deaf persons don't have qualified teachers, special education teachers that are there to make sure that their educational needs are met. Most of the deaf schools in Nigeria don't have enough sign language interpreters to help the deaf persons. And it's quite sad that most schools where there are mainstreamed, you have the hearing and the deaf. Most times they leave these deaf persons to their fate. They don't provide interpreters for them to learn, for them to actually understand what is being taught in class. And this is actually a very big challenge in Nigeria. Because if a deaf person doesn't go to school, just imagine, how will he acquire the basic literacy skills? How will he acquire literacy? How will he even be able to communicate using sign language? So you can see that the educational challenges is something that really needs to be addressed. And then we'll talk about the employment barriers. We've seen a case where a deaf person gets an employment, or you've seen that this person is qualified, this person is suitable for this job. Now the organization will tell you, oh, we cannot hire you and still hire an interpreter in the office that will be interpreting for you. So we can't afford it. So you see that even when the deaf person is able to scale through school, getting an employment also becomes. We also talk about the negative attitude that most of these employers dish out to the deaf. Most times if they have, let's say, meetings, staff meetings, it becomes difficult for this deaf person to be a part of this meeting because the employer will not make effort to provide a sign language interpreter that would be able to pass the message down to the deaf. And all this poses challenges, and the effects will be increased rate of unemployment among deaf persons in Nigeria. Another challenge is availability of assistive devices. Most of assistive devices like the hearing aid and some communication tools, they are not readily available to the deaf. Most of these persons are hard of hearing. This means that with the aid of a hearing aid, a cochlear implant, they would be able to hear. But now, if you look at it, these things are not readily available, and even when they are available, they are quite expensive. So how many hard of hearings would afford to get a hearing aid? So this is part of the challenges that deaf persons in Nigeria face. So we have inadequate legislation and implementation. Yes, we have the disability law that was passed in 2018, the Discrimination Against Persons with Disability Prohibition Act. Yes. And from then, 5 years was given for it to be implemented. Okay, so you give 5 years for people to domesticate the law, for people to incorporate all what they need to ensure an inclusive society. But now, we find out that this 5 years has elapsed, but some persons are still to domesticate these laws. Some persons are still to implement these laws, and we don't have a force that makes sure that everybody is compliant to this law, to make sure that this law is being enforced. So this is also a big challenge to deaf persons in Nigeria, to have lack of data and awareness. If you observe very well, we don't have sufficient data when it comes to disability matters in Nigeria. I think the last that actually captures the number of persons with disabilities is the health survey that was done in 2018, and the census of so many years back. After that, I don't think there has been concrete research that has been done in documenting. So the absence of data reduces evidence-based research, which could actually help to get more information about the challenges faced by persons with disabilities, the challenges faced by the deaf cluster in Nigeria. And also, there is need for awareness, because there's lack of awareness. There's need for awareness so that the government, policymakers, and others would be fully aware of the importance of disability as a developmental issue. Okay, so we did a very short survey, and here are the responses we got. So some say that the inability of the deaf persons to communicate makes them feel lonely. Some are not being provided with sign language interpreters, and this is actually not fair. They are not included in the decision making and affairs of the community, and so on and so forth. So away from the challenges faced, Nigeria has actually made effort to ensure that they address the need of deaf persons in Nigeria. So we have the advocacy and the legal protection. They have ratified the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities that recognizes sign language as a language that is used by the deaf persons. This they have done. And also sign language recognition. So currently in Nigeria, there's been efforts made to make sure that sign language is mainstreamed, sign language is recognized as and used as language in Nigeria. I remember the just concluded um, JAMB equal opportunity, the equal opportunity and equal access to higher education in Nigeria. Part of the recommendations that was made in that 2 days conference was for sign language to be adopted in Nigeria as the second official language that is used in the country. And so this is part of the effort that is being made by Nigeria and the government to make sure that the right of deaf persons in Nigeria is being protected and respected. So we have inclusive education. So also as this we have access to inclusive education. So Nigeria is making effort to ensure that the deaf persons have equal access to education. Like I mentioned earlier, they just concluded 2 days conference by JAMB on equal access to higher education in Nigeria. We'll see that the this particular group created by JAMB, they make sure that once deaf candidates are sitting for exams, they provide sign language interpreters there to guide the deaf to read, explain the instructions to the deaf, and so many other things to ensure that it is all inclusive. And so many others are also learning from this, and this is a giant stride to ensure inclusive education in Nigeria. So we'll have collaboration with deaf organizations. So we'll have the Nigerian National Association of the Deaf, which is a key partner in advocating for deaf persons in Nigeria. And these people have collaborated with a lot of persons, a lot of organizations. We have an initiative like the Galadel in Nigeria, Africa. We have what we call the Deaf E3, that's education, empowerment, and employment for deaf persons, championed by NNAD in collaboration with Galadel University and USAID. So these are some initiatives that are in place in Nigeria to ensure that the rights of deaf persons are being protected in Nigeria. Yeah, granted, Nigeria has made a lot of efforts to ensure inclusivity, but there is an aspect that is lacking that needs to be given proper attention, and this is the area of accessibility and emergency service. So we encourage the National Emergency Management Agency, NEMA, to come up with a plan, to come up with a kind of service, probably a hotline that deaf persons can reach out to in times of emergency. Okay, let me give an example. So a deaf person is in, let's say, 5th floor of a building, and there is fire outbreak on the 1st floor, and they want everybody to calm down, and there's fire alarm that everybody should calm down. Of course, hearing persons will hear that, oh, fire, 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 there's fire outbreak, we should calm down. How do you think the deaf person would know? So these emergency things needs to be put in place in buildings, not just NEMA providing hotlines for times of disaster and all. Every public building should have this. In every room there should be this alarm system in case there are deaf persons in there, and of course they won't be able to hear when there is an alert for emergency. So those things would serve as a guide. Those things will serve as an alert system for them to know that there is emergency. So now, what are the next steps toward addressing this stigmatization that is faced by deaf persons in Nigeria and in Africa? First of all, education and awareness. We need to do community outreach, we need to do student programs. Through this, we can create more awareness. We need to educate the people to foster inclusion in schools, do community outreaches, let them understand. The people that think that, oh, deafness is as a result of your ancestors punishing the parents for what they have done in the past, those myths, we need to break these myths. We need to let people understand that these are distinct people with a linguistic identity. We need to do this awareness. It is very important. Next thing is advocacy and policy development. There is need for legal protection that advocates strongly against discrimination. If there is a law that says, oh, if you discriminate against a deaf person, if you're caught doing name calling, if you're caught calling a deaf person Odi, Bebebe, Kuruma, you will go to jail for 2 years. I think people would begin to learn. I think people will begin to do things the right way. And not just making these laws. There should be implementing bodies. There should be bodies that ensure that these laws are being implemented. And then we have policy development as well. Then promotion of sign language and communication. There should be sign language training. We need to promote bilingual education, so deaf persons can train others, because it is actually best to learn sign language from the deaf. So the educated deaf persons can train others in sign language. You can organize sign language trainings for healthcare providers, educators, and some other persons. Also, empowerment and employment opportunities. There is need for skill development, some vocational skills like hair making, bead making, soap making, so many skills that can help to equip the deaf persons and reduce the rate of unemployment and poverty rate in the country. Also, we have the media representation, and so we need to educate the media, let them portray the deaf persons positively. They shouldn't see them as some persons that should be pitied. Yeah, this one is deaf. No, those are not the kind of things we want to see on the media. We want to see deaf persons who are breaking barriers, who are moving forward, who are being empowered to do things. We need to do public campaigns. There's need for accessibility and technology. Assistive devices should be provided for deaf persons. Also, we have collaboration with deaf organizations. There's need for community partnership. There's need for research and data collection, because if there is available data, then people can carry out evidence-based research to further protect and promote deaf inclusion, to further protect the deaf persons, to further bridge the gap the communication gap, to further break the barriers that are faced by deaf persons in Nigeria. Thank you for listening.